have two goals for tonight's lecture. The first one is to help those of you who are about to read the Nichomachean Ethics, to give you some footholds, I guess you probably have read, at least if you're in the Johnson house, but to give you some footholds for a text that can be disorienting at first. It's theoretical in a way you probably haven't really encountered yet. So it's important, I think, to give you a little bit of help on figuring out how to interpret it. The second goal I have for tonight is to be done early. So see how we do with that. I want to start with a little bit of biographical information. Most of this is stuff you could find on Wikipedia, so don't expect any revelations here. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the relevance of some of Aristotle's biography to understanding who he is and how his philosophy relates to philosophies that you're already aware of, especially the philosophy of Socrates and Plato. So all of you have read some Platonic dialogues already. Some of you have read tons of Platonic dialogues already. The question, how do Plato and Aristotle relate to each other, is an important one for you to start thinking about. And here's the thing you will mostly hear. You will mostly hear about Aristotle and Plato as rivals, as sort of the main disagreement in Greek thought. There's truth to that. There are ways in which Aristotle and Plato are importantly different. But I think the more you understand about Aristotle's biography, the more you can understand that Aristotle and Plato are almost in all senses playing on the same team. So the things that they have in common are much more significant than the things they disagree on. And that's not an accident. That's because it was a single school. It was Plato who taught Aristotle everything he knew for the first large portion of his philosophical education. So what do you need to know about Aristotle in order to interpret well the Nichomachean Ethics? But first of all, just helpful to get a timeline. So Socrates is a character in Platonic Dialogues, also a dude. Born around 470 BC, died about 399 BC, from the city of Athens. So those of you who have read, there are actually some dialogues that go pretty deeply into Socrates' biography, and especially his late biography, the end of his life. There's a whole series of dialogues about the trial and execution of Socrates. So Socrates is executed for making a ruckus in Athens. He's asking questions nobody wants asked, especially about the nature of good government. He's got a whole bunch of young followers who aren't listening to the authorities in the way that everybody wishes they would, basically making a nuisance of himself, and as a result, gets himself killed. Mostly gets himself killed because he won't leave. So the way that Socrates' trial goes, he's sentenced to death, and mostly what that means is he should have some of his rich friends pay to have him leave Athens. So it's a good bet that the death sentence on Socrates was never intended to be carried out. The intention was for Socrates just to leave Athens. So it's just sort of a way of getting rid of a nuisance. And Socrates kind of calls their bluff, in a sense, by saying, okay, you sentenced me to death, I'll stay here and I'll die. And that's, so that's, anyway, but that's more about Socrates than anyone else. Okay, so Socrates, born in 470 BC, died 399 BC. Plato is born in 428 BC-ish, dies 347 BC. He's also from Athens, and he is a student of Socrates's. So there's endless debate when you read the Platonic dialogues about whose voice you're hearing. Whether when Socrates talks, Socrates is saying things that the historical Socrates said, or that having a good time there, Justin? That's fine. I feel sorry for you guys, and I'm sorry that I'm talking as you're coming in. I know that's hard. Where was I?
Whether Socrates.
Right. Thank you. So there's a lot of question about when you read a Socratic or a Platonic dialogue, whether this is sort of Plato puppeteering and all the things that Socrates is saying are things that Plato actually thinks, or whether Plato is more recording things that Socrates actually said. Is he more a student or more a master? And there's no evidence in any way for any conclusion to this question. One way that scholars have sort of suggested it might be the case, they've sort of done a chronological ordering of the Socratic dialogues. And by the way, it's not. It's sort of a cyclical thing, because they determined the chronology in part on the basis of this theory that then they used the chronology to demonstrate. But the idea is that what are called early dialogues are dialogues in which what Plato is doing is writing down stuff Socrates said. And then in later dialogues, what Plato is doing is kind of using Socrates as a puppet to say whatever it is that he thinks. So there's a claim that you can sort of track the progression of Plato's thought by looking at the difference between the early, the middle, and the late Socratic works, or Platonic works, to figure out which ones are actually Plato's and which ones are Socrates's. Anyway, okay. So that's Socrates and then Plato. So remember, Plato, born in 428 BC, died in 347 BC. Aristotle is born in 384 BC and died in 322. He's born in Greece, but not in Athens. He's born in a city called, I've been practicing this, Chalcidice. It doesn't look like that. And so this is north of Athens. And it's actually, so his father is the sort of the court doctor for a dude named Amyntas II of Macedon. And he's a sort of petty tyrant. So this is a king of Macedon, and Aristotle's father, whose name is Nichomachean, as is his son's, is the doctor for this court. So if you think about this, this actually gives us a couple of really interesting pieces of information. The first interesting piece of information it gives us is that Aristotle's whole life is going to be political, right? He starts off as a man who is related closely to a warlord. And as he continues his entire life, he's going to continue to be related to Macedon, and especially the Macedonian leaders. And that's going to continue to play an important role in what he's able to do and what he has to do and what he has to run away from as his life continues. So Aristotle's life has always been and will always be political in a way that Socrates' and Plato's weren't. And then the second thing to notice is his dad is a doctor, which means that his background is going to be scientific in a way that Socrates' and Plato's aren't. And that's going to come through in his philosophy for the rest of his life. He's going to continue to be about what's called empirical knowledge. So knowledge that you gain on the basis of looking at individual facts and starting to piece together sort of truths about the physical world by looking at individual examples, as opposed to the method that both Socrates and Plato prefer, which is a method that sort of starts with big picture reasoning, right? So you start with thinking about the way that big ideas relate to each other and make progress in your knowledge from there. So there's the famous painting in Athens of Athens, right, of the philosophers of Athens. If you look at it, it's on every Torrey thing. In fact, the Torrey thing is just Plato and Aristotle, and Plato is going like this, right? One finger pointing upwards. Look up at the one thing. Aristotle is going like this. Look down at the many. You see that? So Plato's interested in this sort of the one idea, the one guiding idea that's at the center of everything. Aristotle's interested in starting with particulars, starting with individual pieces of knowledge, and then piecing together a greater and greater theory about the way that the world is. That's one of the main differences that people are going to note as they talk about Plato versus Aristotle. Now, having said that, It is not the case that Plato doesn't think we should look at individual exemplars or that we can learn things from looking at the physical world. We get all kinds of examples of Plato saying things precisely like that. It is also not the case that Aristotle thinks we should never think about big conceptual ideas or that there's a way of starting from rational ideas and getting to knowledge. So these are sort of the two caricatures of these two men, is that they have these opposing views. Not a really helpful way of thinking about them, because in a lot of ways they're actually way, way closer than that caricature would make you think. Okay, so when Aristotle is 17, he travels to Athens and he becomes a student in Plato's academy. And he stays there for 20 years until Plato's death. Now, what did Aristotle learn in all of this time? He's Plato's star student for most of the time that he's there. And by the way, maybe you don't know this, but so Socrates is kind of dude on the street, sort of philosopher, vagrant, who kind of walks around and talks to people. Plato actually has an academy. And actually, so I'm an academic, that word goes all the way back to Plato's academy. This place where this sort of the school that Plato teaches at, and he brings any number of people to come, and all the sort of young men of Athens come to him, and he teaches them. So Aristotle comes to be a part of this academy, stays there for 20 years. So we know that there was a tremendous amount of influence that Plato had in Aristotle's education. One of the ways we know that is that all of Aristotle's finished works were actually dialogues, just like Plato's. So here's a common misconception, is that the thing you have is the thing that Aristotle intended you to have. Actually not the case. The thing you have is lecture notes. Possibly Aristotle's lecture notes, possibly one of Aristotle's students' lecture notes. So whatever you're writing down here of what I'm saying, it's possible that what we have of Aristotle is that. So think about the relationship between that and what I'm saying, right? And think about the relationship between that, what I'm saying, and what I would write if I had years to write down exactly what I thought. There's sort of a light years amount of distance between the two. So one way that people sometimes think about the difference between Plato and Aristotle is to think, well, Plato is thinking in these sort of image-driven narrative dialogues. Aristotle is thinking in these very rigorous, logical, proofy kind of linear arguments. And in fact, a lot of Western philosophy has sort of picked up this style that they get from Aristotle. But it's not a very good style to pick up, in the sense that that's not the style that Aristotle chose. Aristotle chose to communicate in dialogues exactly like Plato's. And if we still had those dialogues, we would be able to see. I mean, who knows? It has been claimed by ancient folk who had read both that Aristotle actually wrote more beautiful dialogues than Plato's. I find that hard to believe, but it's at least somebody thought so. So when you think about sort of the style of an Aristotelian piece of philosophy as opposed to a Platonic one, that style difference doesn't actually say anything about the difference in their philosophies. They don't have different approaches to doing philosophy. Both of them think that dialogues are the right way to do philosophy, in written philosophy. Both of them think that that's the way to get you closest to whatever it is that the goal of the philosopher should be. So there's definitely influence going the direction of Plato to Aristotle, and that's one of the indications of it, is the style in which they write. There's also probably influence going the other direction. So there are a couple of dialogues that people have suggested might be the way they are because Aristotle was an influence on Plato. So especially the Timaeus. Which I don't know how those of you who are in the Morgan House will have read, and older Johnson Hausers. So the Timaeus is a Platonic dialogue that's all about the way in which this physical world is patterned off of a world of ideas, such that you can learn about the world of ideas by looking at the natural world. You can understand the way that this sort of perfect world is by looking at the way it is patterned in the world of sensory objects. Some people have said, doesn't that sound like something Aristotle would say? And it does. So it's possible that this, which is a later dialogue of Plato's, is actually a dialogue that he wrote maybe in response to or partly because of conversations he'd had with his star student who was making him think differently about the natural world and the kind of things we can learn from the natural world. Okay, so lots of influences, mutual influences probably between these two incredible figures. When Plato dies, Aristotle leaves Athens. Does it for probably two reasons. One of them is, and this, who knows, but generally this is thought to be one of the things that made him leave is he thought he was going to be running the academy when Plato died. And instead it was Plato's nephew who got to run the academy when Plato died. So possibly he was a little piqued that he didn't get to take over the academy. The second reason, remember Aristotle's life is always political. Philip the Great, who is at this point the leader of the Macedonians, is getting awfully aggressive with Athens and the Athenian territory. So there's significant anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens, and it's getting a little bit dicey for Aristotle to be there because he's so closely associated with Macedon. So he has to leave in order to sort of get out of the hot water that Philip the Great is causing for him. So he moves to present-day Turkey, and here's a place where he does a ton of biological research. So in a lot of ways, Aristotle is the first biologist, and he sort of begins thinking about the method. How do we do biology? How do we collect specimens? How do we think about them? How do we categorize them? How do we draw and understand all of these different specimens that we can get? How do we get a handle on the natural world? So he does a bunch of this work there. He also gets married, and he gets married to another petty tyrant's daughter, which just appears to be the thing that he's good at relating himself to these sort of local warlords. And then fairly shortly after he gets married, this petty tyrant gets deposed, and it gets very dangerous for him to be living in the place that he's living in, so he has to leave. So he goes to the island of Lesbos and stays there for a while until he is summoned by Philip the Great, so the same dude who made it hard for him to be in Athens. Philip the Great asks him to come back to Macedon and start educating his son, Alexander. So he does. He goes back to basically his hometown, or close to his hometown, and he's put in charge of educating the next generation of Macedonian tyrants, including, you guessed it, Alexander the Great. So this is one of those really interesting moments in history where it turns out that philosophy doesn't have nothing to do with the real world, right? here's this guy who's going to go off and sort of change the face of the Western world. And his early education is an education he got from Aristotle. So Aristotle is there for a number of years until Alexander probably gets his dad killed. We don't know this for sure, but it's very likely that Alexander actually arranges for his father's death so that he can take over. And at this point, he sends Aristotle back to Athens. Now, why would he do that? It's not for Aristotle to get back in the graces of the sort of the Platonic court or the Platonic group of philosophers that he had been with before. Alexander tells him, no, you set up your own school. You set up a school that will be competing with the academy. And the reasons for doing this are really interesting. So whereas in Socrates' time, being Socrates means you're political in the sense that you're annoying, but not in the sense that you have power. Well, in 2 generations, that significantly changed in Athens. Being at the center of the philosophical world in Athens actually gives you significant influence over the politics of Greece. So Alexander wants a hand in that. He wants to be to sort of have an ally or a minion in Athens, impacting the philosophical world on his behalf. So he sends Aristotle back to Athens in order to do that. And the school that he founds is a school called the Lyceum, which is probably another word you've probably heard used in the sort of the great texts world. So Aristotle does this. And most of what we have, most of the sort of extant works on Aristotle are probably lectures that he gave while he was teaching here in Athens. This is the sort of the period of his life that we have access to through these notes that have survived. The school is called Peripatetic. Here's the part where you learn an impressive word. Peripatetic. That probably refers to the peripatoi, which were sort of columns. That's a Greek word for the kinds of columns that were in this lyceum, the place where Aristotle taught. But most people think, this is not only do you learn a word, but you learn that most people use it wrong. Most people think that it's actually from the word peripatetikos, which means walking. So most people will tell you the reason why Aristotelians are called peripatetics is because they didn't do their philosophy sitting down in a room. They did their philosophy walking around looking at stuff. So it's probably not actually the etymology of the word, but it actually is a helpful thing to remember because the difference between Plato and Aristotle is continued in the method, in the way that they taught. So Aristotle really would go on field trips all the time with his students because he wanted them to look at stuff. He wanted them to do biology. He wanted them to be observational theorists and not merely rational ones. So they're walkers. They walk around and see what they can and try to learn. There's also an emphasis amongst Aristotle scholars. One of the things that he asks his students and his fellow teachers to do is he wants to collect books. So he asks, he's trying to build a library, and he's also wanting to collect natural specimens. So he wants to get birds, fish, insects, everything he can. He wants to get natural objects to study. And there's a good story, who knows if it's true or not again, but kind of a neat story is that he asked Alexander to send him back cool stuff he found while on his journey raping and pillaging his way through Europe. and so Aristotle would sort of keep an eye out and have his men keep an eye out for interesting new natural objects that weren't native to Greece and then send them back to Aristotle so that he could study them and sort of build his knowledge of the natural world in that way. So that's good fun. In 323, Alexander dies. Oops. Of course, Athens isn't so happy about having Macedonians around anymore now that Alexander isn't, tyrannizing them and junk. So an Athenian politician named Demosthenes does something that will sound familiar to you. He charges Aristotle of impiety. And rather than making the choice that Socrates made, Aristotle chooses to leave the city. He just says, no, peace out. And he goes back home, actually, to his mother's estate, which is on a Greek island, and dies the next year. So that is the end of his life, right there. And there's a story that's probably apocryphal that he dies going out into the harbor in a sort of particularly dangerous harbor to measure the tides. So it's sort of, he dies in the midst of the same empirical research that sort of characterized him. Probably not true, but it's a nice story. Okay. So that's Aristotle's biography. That's a little bit of background into who he was, what made him who he was. And I just want to talk briefly about a couple of things that are important to know about him as a thinker. And I think things that will help you especially understand the way that he's communicating in the Nichomachean ethics. First, sort of methodological things. I've already said this, but I'll just say it again. It's hard to know what Aristotle's philosophical method would be if we had the rest of his writings. So because all we have is his lecture notes, we don't have a ton of evidence of the way that he goes about thinking. But we do know something about the way he goes about lecturing. And the way he goes about lecturing is extremely systematic, right? His whole goal is to create categories and definitions that help him understand the world. So he really does do philosophy like a biologist, right? He's interested in sort of characterizing and understanding species. So the Nichomachean Ethics is sort of a case in point, right? This is a whole book devoted to characterizing and understanding a specific species, humans. And he'll do similar things. So those of you who have read the physics, he's doing this in terms of the natural world more generally. De Anima is a text that's about doing that with different kinds of soul. Yes, there are different kinds of soul. There are plant souls, according to Aristotle. There are animal souls, and there are human souls. Basically, a soul, anima, source of movement, right? So to animate. So everything that moves itself has a soul. And he's interested in categorizing these different kinds of souls and understanding the sort of which things fall into each category, how do these categories relate, questions like that. So it helps to think about him as a scientist. When you read a text like the Nichomachean Ethics, it helps to think about the way in which he is systematically trying to categorize all of the elements of what it is to be a virtuous human being, give you definitions for them, show you how to locate them, right? It's a biology textbook, except about ethics instead. In terms of his ideology, so if he's sort of interested in observation, the next question is, what does he see, right? When he looks at a human being, what does he see? When he looks at any natural object, so natural as opposed to man-made, what does he see? And here's a place where I just find Aristotle endlessly rich and fascinating. So when Aristotle looks at anything that exists naturally, he says that there are sort of 4 ways that we can ask a "what is it" question about something that exists naturally. Or another way to put it, maybe not a "what is it" question so much as a "how did this thing get to be what it is" question. So, or why is this thing the way it is? So the first answer to that question, so I like talking about kitty cats in relation to Aristotle, as any of you who have had me in an Aristotle session will know. So I look at my kitty cat and I say, why is my kitty cat the way that she is? Well, one of the answers to that question is because she was born by kitty cats, right? So the reason why she is the way she is has to do with her parentage, right? And it turns out her parents had a particular characteristics, particular shape, particular genetic code. You can even think about that. So Aristotle is never going to use that language, but it's actually, it works fine to think about genetic codes with Aristotelian thought. He's got something like that in mind. So partly the reason why my kitty cat is the way that she is because of where she came from, what's called her efficient cause. That's what he would call it. So the most recent thing the most recent domino that fell over to create this domino, right? And that happens to be her mommy and daddy kitty cats, right? Those are the ones that were the most recent cause of her. Then there's a second way of asking that question. So why is my kitty cat the way she is? And that's what he will call the material cause. So that's, well, she's the way she is because of the stuff she's made of. If my kitty cat were made of lead, her characteristics would be much different than they are. If she were made of bubbles, her characteristics would be much different than what they are. But it turns out she's made of muscle and sinew and bone and fur. Those elements that she's made up of have significant explanatory power in terms of understanding why she is the way she is. The third, and that's called the material cause. The third way of answering that question is by talking about her shape. So why is my kitty cat the way that she is, or what makes her herself? Well, she's got 4 legs, she's got sharp teeth, she's got eyes that are very good at seeing in the dark, right? All of those things about her form impact what kind of a thing she is, what she's able to do. And so that's the formal cause. That's the third kind of cause. So all of those, I think, sound like things we can get on board with. Sound like things that we would have done in a biology class thinking about a kitty cat. But then there's a fourth cause, and this is the part that I think is really, really nifty about Aristotle. So he's going to say, so it turns out these 3 other causes, these 3 other ways of thinking about my kitty cat, are all actually bound together. They're bound together in this final cause. And this final cause has to do with what my kitty cat is meant to do, what my kitty cat is meant to be. So think about it this way. If I am making an axe, let's say, I'm going to have to ask myself a bunch of questions. The first question is going to be, what should I make this out of? Another question is going to be, what shape should I make this? How am I going to answer those questions? Well, the main thing I'm going to ask myself is, well, what do I want it to do, right? So what I want this object to do once I'm done with it is going to dictate, do I make it out of bubbles? Do I make it out of Jell-O? No, I think I have to make it out of something harder than that if it's going to be able to do the thing I want it to do. I think I have to probably make the handle out of wood, at least, and like something even harder for the top, right? It's going to have to be pretty solid if it's going to do the thing that axes do. Well, and then, what shape am I going to make it? Well, again, notice how the answer to that question is an answer I can only have once I understand what it is that an axe is for, right? What its purpose is. Once I understand what its purpose is, I can understand what shape it needs to be. So it's going to have places you can grab onto it. Probably don't want those places to be spiky or slippery or anything like that, right? Also going to have something that comes at a wedge and is very hard, right? Those are all elements of the shape that this thing is going to have to be in order for it to be capable of doing the thing that it does. So we all understand the way that this works with man-made objects. We all understand that man-made objects have purposes, and it's the purpose that dictates the form and the material. Aristotle thinks exactly the same thing is going on with natural objects. He thinks that natural objects are made of what they're made of, and they're shaped the way they're shaped in order for them to do the things they're supposed to do. And he thinks that we can figure out what they're supposed to do by looking at what they're made of and how they're shaped. So, kitty cats have sharp teeth, which means they're probably not supposed to eat plants. My kitty cat does eat grass when she wants to throw up, but mostly she eats meat, right? Which makes sense. It makes sense that she has the shape that she has and that her teeth are made of what they're made of because that allows her to do the thing that she's supposed to do. She has eyes that can see in the dark. Also helpful if you eat meat, right? So all of these elements of her shape and the fact that she's made of such springy stuff, right? She can, I mean, compared to me, the distance that she can jump, right, like sort of proportionate to her size is insane, right? Like she can clear a 6-foot wall. She's like, you know, that. So the way that she's put together, the things she's made of, all of these things sort of come together in a way that allows her to do the thing that she's meant to do. And I can figure out what she's meant to do by looking at the way that she's made, by looking at the things that she's capable of. I can also tell whether she's doing a good job at being a kitty cat or not on the basis of these things. Notice? So if I look at her and I say, man, you're awful springy, and looks like you've got eyes that are good for hunting and teeth and claws that are good for hunting, but you're also 40 pounds, which means that you can really kind of barely clear the floor as you walk. You're bad at being what you are, right? Like there are kitty cat things that are sort of built into being a kitty cat that you can't do anymore. You're not flourishing as a kitty cat, right? Think about plants. You can do a similar thing. I can walk up to a plant and tell whether it's flourishing or not, right? Is it, are the leaves the color they're supposed to be? Is it producing new growth? Is it producing seeds that are going out and reproducing more plants of its kind, right? All of those things are indications of health. So if I look at the shape and the material of a plant, I can figure out what it's supposed to be doing, and then I can also figure out whether it's succeeding or not, whether it's doing the thing it's meant to be doing. So if that's the theory, if that's the way of thinking about natural objects, it turns out that there's an objective way of looking at a natural object and figure out whether it's doing what it's meant to do, whether it's being the kind of thing it's meant to be, whether it's flourishing. And Aristotle has no problem applying the same set of concepts to being a human, right? So this is where the Nichomachean ethics comes in. The Nichomachean Ethics is a book where Aristotle looks real carefully at what kind of material a human being is made of and what a human being's form is. And don't think of form only in terms of shape. Think of form in terms of things like I have a rational mind. Those kinds of things, Aristotle thinks, if I think about those carefully, if I understand the form and the material of a human being carefully, I can understand the telos. That's the Greek word for this end or this final purpose. I can understand the telos of a human being. And then I can figure out whether a particular human being is flourishing or not, whether a particular human being is succeeding in being the kind of thing that a human being is supposed to be. And the whole of the Nichomachean Ethics is a story of Aristotle looking around at human beings and saying, see that one? That one seems to be doing the thing that it can do. That one seems to be doing the thing that it is a shape of a human being to do. And it seems like if you depart too far from these particular excellences, these particular I did a human thing things, you stop being good at being human, right? And it's bad for you, right? You stop flourishing in the same way that my kitty cat would stop flourishing if she became a vegetarian, or if she got too fat to be able to run around the way she's supposed to. It's sad to say, if she lost a leg, right? She's still a kitty cat, but there are all kinds of kitty cat things that she's not doing, that she's supposed to be able to do because of the kind of thing she is. So the question is, how do we make human beings who can do all the human things and who can do them as excellently as possible, who can most do human, most successfully, most flourishingly be what it is to be a human being? And that's the project of the ethics. That's the thing that Aristotle is interested in describing to us, and the thing that he's interested in sort of engaging us in the pursuit of. He wants to cast this vision for what it is to be human, show us that that's what it looks like to be a healthy, flourishing human being, and then convince us to try to go after it, convince us to try to become that thing that he's describing, that healthy, flourishing human being. So in a lot of ways, even though this text feels very academic, the result, the impact that it can have is actually very sort of spiritual formation oriented, right? This is a text that's asking you to think about what kind of shape, what kind of form you have, and whether you're flourishing at being the thing that you are, or whether there's a way for you to develop virtues. So virtue is just a way of thinking about these sort of, I'm doing the human stuff and I'm doing it like a human, right? He's helping us sort of perceive where we're doing human well and where we're not, and how to pursue what it is to be human, what it is to most embody this sort of flourishing, healthy human life. I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions? Yeah.
What was the name for the fourth cause?
Called the final cause. Yeah. So efficient, material, formal, and final. Mm-hmm.
Is that different from the proper cause in Aquinas?
Oh yeah, so Aquinas is an Aristotelian, yeah, he's importing these causes pretty much directly. Yeah. So you get another window into Aristotelian thought if you think about Aquinas. Yeah.
You were talking about how the purpose comes before the object being made, in a sense.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to word this exactly. What do you think of, like, someone makes an object or like invents something, but its full potential isn't really realized until later?
Yeah.
Who, I guess, is responsible?
Yeah.
For that new purpose, I guess.
Yeah.
To go along with that, like, God creates everything. We then use it to make something new.
Right.
Add potential to it.
Right.
And who kind of gets the credit?
That's a good question. That's not a question that I see Aristotle dealing with, but I think that's really interesting. The idea that a thing could have a purpose that's not apparent to its maker. I have an easier time imagining that with man-made objects than I do with God-made objects, right? So it's hard to imagine a sort of a purpose for a human being that he didn't predict. And it's also, I think, harder for me to imagine a purpose for a human being that sort of falls outside of the things that a human being was made to be. It seems like man-made objects are more ambiguous by nature than natural objects in terms of what they're good for and what makes them happy, what makes them healthy. Yeah. In terms of man-made objects, I think that there's a really interesting ambiguity there. So we make things with purpose, but we also make them not fully understanding what kinds of purposes they could have. So it's sort of we're partially imitating the creative act, but not totally. There's more of an opportunity for communion there with other people. That's interesting. Yeah.
So Aristotle was an observational theorist.
Mm-hmm.
Was that your term, or is that?
So mostly people would think about him as being an empirical thinker. So that's a way to talk about him that sounds smart and is mostly true. Yeah.
So my question is, how would you suggest for us to be empirical thinkers or observational theorists
Yeah.
in a practical way?
Yeah.
Here in Torrey and
Yeah. Well, so interestingly, Torrey is actually way more of an empirical project than you might think. So we ask you a question, and what do you do to go about answering it? Well, you go collecting evidence, right? And you collect that evidence and systematize it and put it together into a meaningful answer to the question. Now, the evidence is mostly textual, right? The evidence is mostly evidence that you gather from looking at the text, and then sometimes from thinking about your own life and things like that. But it's actually, we are more of an empirical learning style in Torrey than we are a sort of a rationalistic learning style. We don't start with sort of big ideas and deduce other ideas from them. We start with data. We start with sort of the object, the observation of a text, and move from that to understanding. In terms of thinking about life, I think. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about Aristotle is he thinks that it's not all that ambiguous what makes for a good human life. And that makes him very, very surprising given the culture that you live in, right? Because the culture that you live in mostly says there's no way to know what makes for a healthy human life. Everybody's choice is equally valid, right? And so the fact that Aristotle thinks it's sort of easily observable which kinds of lives make for flourishing and which kinds don't, I think is worth at least testing, right? It's worth looking around at the data around you and seeing whether you can discern what kinds of life lead to flourishing and which kinds don't. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
So when you say that's for the hand.
I figured that.
So you say we can tell. We use the final cause to sort of go back and forth and tell the other causes. You can also tell whether or not something's being successful.
Yeah.
So my question is, if you had a cat that was both agile and let's say it's springy and has teeth, but it's also 40 pounds overweight.
Uh-huh.
Now you're using those first three causes to tell what the fourth cause is. So if you don't know what a cat's for, you look at the first three, right?
Yeah.
And this particular cat shows you that he's overweight, right? So it seems like from that you would not deduce that he's supposed to hunt, right?
Oh.
And so how would you know that? Or let's say if you studied 5 cats and they all happen to be flawed in some major way, it seems like you'd get the incorrect thing. Or to take it with like humans, like Aristotle's into humans thinking, right?
Yeah.
But if Aristotle observes a lot of humans and finds that a lot of them are bad in all the ways he thinks humans ought to be good, then what made him decide that being good in this way was what it was supposed to be, since most humans are not successful at it?
Right. So notice, no matter how much weight my cat gains, she doesn't stop having sharp teeth and eyes that are good at seeing in the dark, right? So even if she's not maximizing those capacities, right, the only things that need sharp teeth are things that have to kill things that move, right? If she didn't have sharp teeth, it would indicate that she ate plants, which don't go anywhere when you try to eat them. So you don't have to be fast. But the fact that she has sharp teeth indicates to me that she has that there's a formal sort of movement towards a particular kind of virtue. Even if I never see a cat that does that thing well, I can still see that that's a thing a cat's supposed to be able to do. Otherwise, there would be this sort of uselessness to the form. And so I think the same thing would go for human rationality, right? Like, even if I never see a human being exercising reason well, the fact that human beings sort of have those teeth, even if they never use them, is an indication that that's a part of their form, that that's a thing they're directed towards. I think that's what Aristotle would say. Does that make sense? Does that satisfy you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so if Aristotle is more empirical,
Mhm.
is more observational,
Yeah.
I guess, what would Plato be?
Yeah, so the other term, if you want sort of intro to philosophy terms, there's empiricism and rationalism. So empiricism starts with data, rationalism starts with ideas. So if you think about the way that Plato starts a conversation, it's usually a conversation about a word, right? So let's try to define virtue together, or let's try to define piety together, or let's try to define justice together. And then he does a whole bunch of maneuvering in the world of ideas, right? Well, does that definition work? No, it doesn't seem to. There's a contradiction over here. And it's this linguistic and conceptual dance that ends up sort of moving into greater understanding of the term. You see how that's different from sort of an observational approach to knowledge? And again, these aren't hard and fast, right? So it's not that neither uses the tools of the other. This is just sort of a big caricatured distinction between the two. But that's the gist of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.